Hogs almost dragged down the Dogs from number 1. Survive and advance, people. Those are the ramifications we will be talking about from the Auburn-Ole Miss thriller. And, well, the Gators devoured the Dogs, those other Dogs, and the East is now in chaos in the SEC. And who's Dak Heisman? And does the bowling ball on his same team, will that possibly miss out for Mississippi State because they got a little Heisman contention going on there in Starkville? This is the SEC in 60. This is 60 full minutes of SEC football each and every week. I would be your host, Mark Rogers, Mark Rogers TV, and we get on some of the best guests across the nation to talk about your favorite conference, SEC, and nothing but SEC football. So when you catch us in March, when you catch us in June, it's still going to be nothing but 60 minutes of SEC football all the time. Before we get into it with Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com, and also a little bit later in the hour, Brittnee Taylor Newman of Football.com, and she also writes for Last Word on Sports. We're going to let you know that if you miss us on Google Hangouts live every Monday, so it's every Monday live on Google Hangouts at noon for 60 full minutes, you can catch the SEC in 60 a number of ways, so there are no excuses for not checking us out. You can check out my podcast on Mark Rogers TV. Go to iTunes. It's one of the SEC in 60 listings, or go to Podbean, where it's uploaded just minutes after the show's completed here on Monday. So if you can't watch us, you can listen on the podcast version. Also, go to YouTube at Mark Rogers TV. I've got nothing but college football videos there, just about 1,000. And we've broken the 1,000 barrier for college football videos this season. Check us out there at Mark Rogers TV at YouTube, and also MarkRogersTV.com. Follow us on Twitter, of course, Mark Rogers TV. It's easy to remember, Mark Rogers TV on Twitter as well, and also our Facebook fan page, Mark Rogers TV. All right, let's talk about the football games this past Saturday, because once again, it's been like this pretty much the last half of the season. The focus and attention of college football, not just on the SEC, not just on the SEC West, on the state of Mississippi. It all went down in the state of Mississippi. 9, 10 o'clock at night, you're watching college football, and you're locked in. You're locked in on Starkville and Oxford, and it was all going down right there with the Bulldogs going down 10-0 to Arkansas, battling their way back to win that thing 17-10. Had to make a play in the end zone to finish that thing off against the 0-5 conference team in Arkansas, who's, again, well, much better than the record would say. And then, of course, Ole Miss goes down in another thriller, this time with some points on the board with the Auburn Tigers in town, and that was a great game with, unfortunately, some controversy and, unfortunately, an injury to one of the top wide receivers in college football. All right, let's dig in with Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com to talk about last weekend's matchups, and then we project ahead to Saturday and what could happen again in the SEC with a bit of a light schedule, but still some important games, especially now that you consider that the SEC East is wide open. All right, Joe, thanks so much for joining us, man. How are you?
I'm doing well, Mark, trying to recover over a great weekend of SEC football, some great games. Can't wait to see what week number 10 has in store for us, week number 11.
Man, this Ole Miss football team once again for a second consecutive week can kick themselves and kick because it was 2 late drives. It was right down to the goal line. It was Bo Wallace fumbling about the 6-yard line. Then it was Laquan Treadwell, and what an effort the kid made catching the ball, getting near the goal line, and wow, it was close enough for the refs to call it a touchdown on the field. Video replay apparently confirmed that he didn't break the plane. If the nose of that football wasn't close to that white line, wow, there was a credit card difference that could have been slid right between that football and that goal line. And Chris Frost made the forced fumble, and Casanova McKenzie scrambled with a bunch of rebels on the field and maybe saved Auburn's season right there. So, man, your thoughts about Auburn and Ole Miss and what happened in that one?
Just a great game. It seems like Auburn plays these games each and every week, and in the end, they seem to find a way to pull out the victory. You look at this Auburn team coming into this matchup, they were averaging 281 rushing yards per game, but they put up a very balanced attack against Ole Miss, and it was Nick Marshall's ability to throw over the top of that defense. You look at his performance on Saturday, 15 of 22 for 254 yards, 2 big touchdowns, 1 INT, but they were balanced. 254 passing yards, 253 rushing yards. Artis-Payne had another solid day, 143 rushing yards, and they won the turnover battle, Mark, something that Auburn does in these big matchups, especially on the road. That's what you need to be able to do, is to create turnovers, and that's what they did. You have to credit Auburn. But Ole Miss, again, back-to-back 2 weeks in a row where they lost games in the last minute, just devastating loss. A young team, Bo Wallace, in my opinion, a solid effort for what he was able to do. 28 of 40, 341, and 2 big touchdowns. But in the end, I think the veteran team in Auburn pulled it out. They've been in these close games before and pulled it out in the end. Just a great SEC game, though.
So, Joe, in the aftermath of what could be called a classic, I don't know what's a classic anymore because it seems like we've got them in college football in dozens every week. Is Ole Miss dead and gone? I know that the losses are to number 3 now in Auburn, and another tough loss at LSU, one of the toughest places to play, where an LSU team, if they defeat Bama, could get themselves into the mix, into the top 10. Is Ole Miss with 2 losses, considering everything that's going on across the country? Are they dead and gone, or is there still a glimpse of hope?
I don't think there is, because of the fact when they lost in the season. If the LSU game was in week number 2 or 3, I would say, yeah, they have an opportunity. But because both back-to-back losses happened so late in the season, late in October, I think it's going to be very difficult for Ole Miss to bounce back. Couple the fact with Kimdichie at the linebacker spot, who's out for the year. I think he was a big loss in terms of run support and an emotional leader for that defense. And I think it's going to be very difficult for Ole Miss to break through to the playoff at this point in the season. Too many teams ahead of them at this point.
Yeah, and to their credit, the losses are to 2 excellent football teams, especially if Auburn makes the Final Four. They're going to be in the college football playoff if they can knock out Alabama, and they're going to have a tough one against Georgia. Let's not dismiss the Bulldogs based on what happened this past Saturday. The committee says that it's going to take injuries into consideration, and unfortunately, Laquan Treadwell, one of the best in the business, gone for the season after breaking his leg on that valiant effort to the goal line. On the flip side, I got 2 questions for you concerning the Tigers. Nick Marshall, we talked about him all off season, about the development of his passing technique, his ability to find the right guy, his ability to deliver the football and improve the technique. Gus Malzahn, that was a focus, a stated, admitted focus to improve this kid. Do you think he's a better quarterback right now than he was this time last year?
I do. Because to Sammy Coates in the second quarter of that ball game, that was really a momentum changer. Ole Miss had seized momentum in the early part of the second quarter, and Nick Marshall's ability and confidence in the pocket. That's the difference this year as opposed to last year. Last year, he improvised more on the run. This year, you see him composed, you see him poised in the pocket, and he's not afraid to stretch the field, and he's got 2 big play wide receivers in Williams and Coates who go up to get the football at the highest point. They challenge defenders, and I think Nick Marshall is a better quarterback this year than he was last year.
Yeah, Coates and Williams just dwarf those Ole Miss defensive backs who are extremely good. Senquez Golson, Mike Hilton, the 2 safeties are bigger, but they're a bit undersized at the corner positions, and that worked, obviously, to Coates and Williams' advantage on a number of plays. Those guys are monsters, and they can just box out and catch the football, pluck it out of the air. So Nick Marshall, I was very impressed the way he threw the football, and I think 22 attempts, that's the perfect Arkansas or Auburn number, with blending in the running game at about 2/3, 3/4 of the time and throwing 22 passes. That's what they want. They need to throw the football, but when they're throwing 22 times and completing 15 for 254, that's chunk yardage in the passing game. And so Auburn, very impressive on offense. The defense, hey, it's not going to be great. It is not going to be great. They still miss Manny Lawson. He may be able to come back for a college football playoff scenario. And they definitely missed Dee Ford and what he was able to give them off the edge going to the NFL this past season. The secondary is not great. It's just not going to be a great defense. But, hey, they came within one play of the national championship last season with pretty much a comparable defense. Is Auburn, Joe, the best one-loss team in the country?
I do think they are. I think they've been there before. They've been in these tight games. I like their ability to rush the football. You mentioned that defense. They're like a bend but don't break type of defense in the second year with Ellis Johnson as defensive coordinator. But the one thing that I'm impressed with is their secondary and their ability to tackle. You watch Auburn in the SEC and you watch them in these games from the linebacker position at Chris Frost and other guys in the secondary. They wrap up and do not give up a lot of yards after the catch. They're very physical, so they may give up a lot of yards, but in the end, in the red zone is when they buckle down, and their ability to create turnovers. I like this Auburn team, and the fact that they're battle-tested is why I believe they're one of the best teams left and one of the best one-loss teams in the nation.
Yeah, Joe, I know the committee is tasked to determine the 4 best teams in the country. I think that's an impossible task. You can try to find the 4 best resumes, the 4 best seasons, regular seasons, the 4 best track record resumes. And I think Auburn's by far got the best one-loss resume when you consider the losses at number 1. Even though it wasn't a real close game, they got back into it, but not really close. The Kansas State win is looking better and better as K-State continues to roll. We'll see what the Wildcats have in the next few weeks because it gets awfully tough for them. And then with this Ole Miss win on the road again, and they just have some superior wins there. They've got the toughest schedule. I don't know if they're the 3rd best team. I don't know if they're one of the 4 best teams in the country. But if they're not, they're awfully close. And they got the best track record. I think TCU's in the mix too. Their track record's pretty good. They've got some impressive showings. Of course, the West Virginia game and the Oklahoma game. So we shall see in the next few weeks. Auburn, Georgia's coming up in a couple weeks as well. All right, just down the road, Joe, in Starkville, I was flipping back and forth. I was just trying to figure out how do I catch both of these scenarios going down at the same time because number 1 was having all sorts of problems with this Arkansas team that, bless their heart in Arkansas. They just continue to come to the brink against really, really good football competition. And the last 3 weeks of the season for the Hogs isn't going to be any kind of a breather in trying to finally break through in the SEC. So the Dogs go down 10-0. They come back. They get it done. Brandon Allen, that's the best football I've seen him play at quarterback for Arkansas. The last couple series, he was really finding guys. He was finding the small window, and he was delivering the football, especially to a kid that really impresses me, Hunter Henry, his tight end for Arkansas. He broke onto the scene last year as an all-SEC second-teamer, and he is really, really good. Guys just bounce off him. He's like Jason Witten out there. He's just a kid who understands the passing game, where to find the open spot, plucks the football out of the air. So he's impressive, but Mississippi State makes the one broken play in the passing game late, and then they hold on for dear life, and Will Redmond gets that pick in the end zone. So your thoughts about Mississippi State? We can't expect anybody to roll every week, and now they've had 2 consecutive games where they've shown some flaws against 2 marginal football teams.
But they got the victory. You look at this victory on Saturday, they put up 459 yards of total offense. They did it through the air, 331 passing yards, only 128 rushing yards. Dak Prescott, pedestrian, 18-27, 331, 1 touchdown, 2 INTs, only had 64 yards rushing on the afternoon. You have to credit Arkansas for taking away the rushing attack of Prescott and Robinson, which really gave them an opportunity to pull out that victory. But Mississippi State gutted it out. 2 back-to-back weeks where they were pushed to the limit, and in the end, they got the victories. One on the road in Lexington and this one in Starkville. Still, in my opinion, a quality win. Rushing offense that can pound the football in Arkansas, push them to the limit, but they found ways to win, a la Auburn last year. I still think Mississippi State, top team in the country, but they're going to be tested, Mark. November 15th when they play the Alabama Crimson Tide.
Yeah, so let's compare these wins, because I'm gonna compare some wins here, because some other teams across the country that are fighting for a football playoff spot have taken some hits for some ugly wins. You mentioned this is a quality win, and I completely get it. Arkansas has taken Bama to a 14-13 game. They should have beaten Texas A&M, and on and on. They played really good football. They completely tore apart Texas Tech out of conference, so they've got a quality, decent Power 5 conference win. All right. Ohio State goes to Penn State. They lose it, or they pull it out in overtime. That's an ugly win. I would consider Penn State and Arkansas pretty comparable. And Ohio State did that in Happy Valley in front of 108,000 versus Mississippi State struggling at home against Arkansas. You know, you've got losses or ugly wins like that for a number of contending teams that seem to have taken a hit. People have forgotten about the Washington State-Oregon game, but the Ducks struggled, and they took a bit of a hit in the rankings for a while on that one. And there's some other teams across the country who have some ugly wins that seem to have been dismissed. Alabama going to Arkansas, only winning by a point. That's kind of washing itself out as well. But there are some teams across the country, and I mentioned Ohio State, because they really got hammered for going to Penn State and barely pulling one out. And I would think Penn State and Arkansas are pretty comparable.
You're right about that. When you look at the Big Ten overall, not getting much love, and I think a lot has to do with the SEC's ability to go to 8 straight national championships. Anytime there's a one-loss SEC team in the mix, look for the committee or look for the AP to put these SEC teams over conferences such as the Big Ten or the Big 12 until they start proving themselves in the bowl season or in these playoff games. Look for the SEC to get the nod. But you're absolutely right. Another team that, to me, is not getting much attention is Michigan State. I know that they lost on the road in Outson, but they only have one loss on the year and have dominated the competition. Another team that, in my opinion, could challenge Michigan State if they can get an opportunity is Nebraska. Nebraska only lost to Michigan State by 5 points. That's their only loss on the year, Mark. So, and when you talk about a state, I think you have to throw in Nebraska as one of those teams as well and win out. They're a team that can make some noise come playoff time.
So for me, Joe, this is the distinction. This is the reason I give Mississippi State a break concerning what could be considered an ugly loss or an ugly win. And so this is the distinction for me, is that they haven't lost a game. So if they lose a game, then I think I would bring this Arkansas game into play. That because now they're matched up against 10 or 12 other one-loss teams. So now you got to start making comparisons. But as long as they stay undefeated, and especially considering their schedule and that they've already beaten Auburn and beaten some really good teams, Texas A&M, and not such a great win now, but definitely that Auburn game at this point, and of course going to Death Valley and beating LSU. So that's the big distinguishing factor for me right now, is just simply you've won them all. You get separated automatically from me, especially in the SEC West, from all these one-loss teams. But if they lose one, and now they're in the free-for-all with everybody else in that one-loss category, then I start looking at this Arkansas game.
Right. I'm in agreement with you, Mark. I could see where you're looking at that.
All right, Joe, we got Florida, we got Georgia, and this took some people by surprise. Nick Chubb ran for 39 yards for a touchdown, and Georgia seemed to be off and running at 7-0. And then 31 straight points later, this turned into a big-time upset that has really shaken up the SEC Eastern Division. So, man, Florida goes in and they go into Jacksonville, and they're determined to run the football. They didn't do anything fancy. It was Kelvin Taylor, it was Matt Jones, and they said Treon Harris, 6 passing attempts. We're going old school to the hilt. 418 yards rushing in this one, Joe. How can you explain this one?
Well, I thought that this would be a tougher matchup than people thought going into this game because it was a rivalry game. I didn't think Florida would get the victory, Mark, but I thought they would play very tough against Georgia. 9 of the last 12 matchups going into this game were decided by 8 points or less. It's a rivalry game. We've seen rivalry games, OU, Texas, very close matchups. So you had to consider that Florida, this would be their season. And credit Will Muschamp, team fell behind 7-0. They were lining up for the field goal to make it a 7-3 ball game, but he rolled the dice.
I think we possibly lost Joe here for a second. We'll just run it down ourselves here with Florida and Georgia, and hopefully Joe can jump back on. It's Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Actually, every Tuesday night, if you're up really late, 12:30 a.m. If you're up at 12:30 a.m., then you join Joe and I. We knock out our predictions. Really, we hand it off to Joe to knock out his predictions. I don't get around to that until like Thursday night. Hey, Joe, you with us? So Florida knocks off Georgia 38-20, and again, we were getting into this rushing attack. The Gators brought the best rushing attack yardage-wise since Emmitt Smith in 1989. Joe, you with us?
Yeah, I don't know if I cut out. What I said is you really have to credit Will Muschamp and the staff for their ability to have their team up. 418 total yards, only 26 passing yards on the afternoon. The field goal, in my opinion, fake field goal changed the momentum of the game, and I was shocked about Mark Richt and Mike Bobo's inability to unleash the passing attack until late in the fourth quarter. It was a rivalry game. I'm shocked that Georgia didn't come into this game focused and emotional, looking to put Florida away early.
We came across an interesting anecdote about this kid that ran for the fake field goal touchdown. He's a fifth-year senior. He just got accepted into Florida Medical School. They caught up with him at Publix, the grocery store. He bags groceries and stocks shelves on Sundays. Every Sunday, since he was a walk-on, he's got the job on the side on Sundays, and people were just coming in there by the droves, taking their pictures with him because he wins the he's the feel-good story for the day for Florida, and it was kind of funny. I saw him in his the whole grocery store gear. And having worked in a grocery store for 6 years, Joe, I can, that made my heart feel good seeing the kid at the grocery store bagging groceries and then turns around and scores the first touchdown for the Gators. And, going to medical school, so good for him. All right, Georgia, SEC East favorite, early loss. They bounce back. They look like the dominant team and by far the best team in the SEC East. And then they lay the ultimate egg here against Florida, getting completely blown out. Your assessment of Georgia and how this Eastern Division race is going to play out from here?
Well, with Georgia, I really feel like the bye week really hurt them in this matchup. It gave Trayon Harris, it gave that offensive line an opportunity to prepare for a solid Georgia defense. And on the flip side, I think it changed the momentum. Sometimes a bye week can help you in terms of injury. In other terms, it could actually be a detriment, affect the timing of the offense, affect defensives, the inability to really swarm the football. And I think that the bye week hurt Georgia more than it helped them. You look at Florida, though, dominant performance. I expect Georgia to get back on track, and I expect Georgia, when they get Gurley back November 15th, to challenge Auburn. But in the end, just a very disappointing loss for a team that had its sights set on a possible outside national championship appearance. If they could have won out, Mark, this was a team that I had going to the national championship. Very disappointing loss. I think they bounce back. How they play against Auburn will dictate the rest of their season, though.
Oh, yeah, if they could have won out, you're looking at 13-1, and they come from the SEC as the SEC champs, and regardless of the East-West inequality, Georgia's going to go to the national championship game. But that's all out the window. They're just trying to play spoiler now, get to the SEC championship game, and then everybody in SEC nation's rooting for the West to defeat the East because Georgia doesn't have a shot at this point with 2 losses. Then again, I don't know that if there's a scenario out there with 2 losses within the SEC that team doesn't get a shot. So this is how it plays out right now, Joe. We got Mizzou on top. Nobody's talking about Mizzou. They haven't played a sexy game for like a month. It's been a lot of Kentucky Vandy jumping out of conference, having some bye weeks. We haven't talked Missouri football for a long time. And a lot of people dismissed them after the 34-0 drubbing at home against Georgia. But right now, Mizzou's sitting there at 4-1. got Georgia at 4-2. We got Florida at 4-3. And even at this late stage in the season, let's consider that for Florida, despite being 2 games back in the loss column to Mizzou, they win most three-way ties. So Mizzou won the football game at Florida in convincing fashion, a very weird football game. Special teams plays all over the place. So despite having the tiebreaker and the 2-game lead, Florida, if they can create the 3-way tie, they win almost all those tiebreakers. So how does this thing play out the last few weeks? Because it's going to be a mess.
I don't know, but Missouri had a dominant effort on Saturday over Kentucky. They held Kentucky to 260 total yards. They got back on track. This was a team that had lost 2 home games on the year to Indiana and Georgia. They absolutely shut out for the first time since 2002 by the Georgia Bulldogs this year. If Missouri wins out and represents the East, they don't have that great of a resume, in my opinion, to make it to the playoff. The only way they can actually get there is if they knock off whoever's coming out of the West right now. So I would think that if you're an SEC East fan, somehow, some way you want the Georgia Bulldogs to get there and represent the East. But in the end, I don't see any way a 2-loss SEC East team can represent the SEC for the playoff at the end of the season at this point, unless we have some major upsets in November.
All right, Joe, here's what I got. I just did a little math on my pad here. Missouri's 4-1. They got Texas A&M on the road. They've got Tennessee on the road. They've got Arkansas. They go 5-3. Let's say they lose 2 of those 3 games. Now, let's say they don't lose 2 out of 3. They're either, wow, that's a tough one to call. Missouri against Texas A&M, Tennessee, who wins those games. Those are going to be really close games, I would expect. So they go 6-2 or 5-3. Well, if they go 6-2, they most likely, Missouri's marching on to the SEC championship game once again. Georgia's at 4-2. They got Kentucky on the road. They have to win. But they got Auburn. So they most likely lose that game. They're 5-3. And then Florida's 3-3 right now, but their games are at Vandy, and they've got South Carolina at home. So for Florida, let's say they finish 5-3. Of course, they've got a sweep, or they're completely out of it. So we got a 3-way tie at 5-3. Unless Mizzou can win 2 out of those 3, then Mizzou's back in the SEC championship game, and that's the way that's going to play out. Unless Georgia can pull it off against Auburn, and that should buy them the ticket to the championship game. That's what it's going to come down to right there. It's either Georgia pulling the upset against Auburn, and they're in the clear, or it's a 3-way tie, or Mizzou with the 4-1 record right now has a shot to run the table. But most likely they go 2-1, and they're off to the championship game in Atlanta at 6-2. Wow, it's just it's a mess over there in the East, and that Eastern Division is going to give. It's possibly not going to be a good SEC championship game, or we're going to see the shocker, and that's going to put all sorts of the fear of God into this college football playoff committee trying to figure out who goes from the SEC. That could be good. Before we run through these games coming up this week real quick here, you mentioned Mizzou knocking off Kentucky. Not a whole lot of people paid attention to that game, but again, it was a Missouri offensive effort that just causes us to wonder about this football team. Matty Mock could barely complete 50% of his passes, $164 through the air. They couldn't run the ball on Kentucky, but the defense is really good. Shane Ray had another big game. He now has set the school sack record for a single season at 12. That was held by Alden Smith and Michael Sam. So impressive on defense against Mizzou. Again for Mizzou, the offense really hasn't brought us much in a long time with Matty Mock at quarterback. All right, Joe, you ready for this week? Here we go. Bama-LSU, that's, of course, the headliner.
I think it's going to be and what they were able to do 2 weeks ago against a very physical, dominant Ole Miss rushing defense, put up 264 rushing yards on them. I'm not so sure Alabama's the same type of defense it was in years past. You look at their last performance in Knoxville with Joshua Dobbs. Tennessee put up 181 rushing yards on that defense. Leonard Fournette, McGee, Hilliard look for the same type of game plan out of Les Miles, and I think somehow, some way, LSU pulls off the upset.
Okay. All right. We're going to remember that. And I'm putting Joe on the spot here, even though we bring him on late Tuesday, 12:30 a.m. If you're out there surfing the net, Google Hangouts 12:30 every Tuesday night going into Wednesday with Joe, where his official predictions are posted. So we just kind of put him on the spot here with these SEC games on Monday. I know, try to shake out the cobwebs from the weekend and make predictions for this coming Saturday. I appreciate it, Joe. So Georgia, Kentucky.
Georgia better get on track. I expect Georgia to really rebound from this upsetting defeat on Saturday in a rivalry game. I look for the offensive line to take over. You look at what Missouri was able to do against Kentucky defensively and shut down Patrick Tolles. I know they're coming back home, but defensively I look for a more inspired effort out of that defense of Damian Swann, and I think they dictate the tempo on Saturday. Nick Chubb rebounds, the offensive line rebounds, and look for Mike Bobo to utilize Hudson Mason in the passing attack now that the season seems in doubt. I think Georgia opens it up against Kentucky and dominates on Saturday in Lexington.
All right, again, it's not going to get a whole lot of people excited, but Florida at Vandy, it's important. Florida could just be witnessing carnage around them within the SEC East, and if they beat Vandy in South Carolina, it could be punching that ticket to Atlanta. Florida at Vandy.
I think it's a close game, to be honest with you. When you look at Florida and Vandy over the last couple of years, Vandy's played Florida very tough. Still not sold on Florida's offensive effort with Trayon Harris. Will Muschamp said that they're going to open it up a little bit more this week, but he is still a freshman. Vandy, defensive-minded head coach, and Derek Mason, I think they challenge Florida, but in the end, Florida picks up a 7-point victory.
Finally, we got a game that's not supposed to be too competitive, but a month ago we would have been thinking, hey, look at this one. This is a good one. Auburn hosting Texas A&M with Kyle Allen in the fray with Kenny Thrill taking that 2-game suspension at quarterback.
It's going to be a close ball game. Knocked off Texas A&M, but Texas A&M and Auburn match up very well against each other. Auburn, though, I think has the edge with quarterback Nick Marshall, his ability to stretch the defense. You look at Kyle Allen and Louisiana Monroe last week outgained Texas A&M in his first storm, but they were able to pull out the 21-16 victory behind Trey Carson and the offensive line. I think that's the type of game they have to get into with Auburn in this matchup. Kyle Allen hasn't played. I don't think they're built to get into a shootout with Auburn this year. Have to keep it low scoring, but in the end, I still like Auburn to get the victory. I think they get about a 10-point victory on Saturday.
10 points? Really? Not 30? I don't think Texas A&M is built to do anything against Auburn. They can get into any kind of game in that one. I just think Auburn's is going to roll unless they take the week off and they're looking ahead, which is quite possible after that titanic battle they had in Oxford. That might wear them out a little bit, and they may just coast to victory here. All right, it's Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Again, it's every Tuesday night where we really put Joe on the spot with his predictions for the entire Top 25 at 12:30 a.m. on Tuesday going into Wednesday. If you want to catch us there, and of course that gets posted to YouTube and MarkRogersTV.com and all those good spots that we post all of our college football content. All right, Joe, we're going to let you go for the day. We appreciate the time, man.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Great show. I'll see you tomorrow night.
Good stuff. That was Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Check him out right there. Actually, Joe is leaving to go to a 25th anniversary party for the New York Giants Super Bowl championship team that beat the Buffalo Bills. So Joe is hobnobbing with the elite of the NFL, and we continue here. But I'm probably in a better position. I kind of like what I have here with Brittnee Taylor Newman coming on. And Brittnee, we thank you so much for once again gracing us this week. So we've got some good subjects to talk about around the SEC. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's freezing here in Florida at 65, so we're all freaking out, breaking out the big jackets and the boots.
You better bundle up soon. 65. I feel for you. I definitely feel for you. Yes, at 65. So, Brittnee, on a big college football day like this past Saturday, and we seem to be lining them up every week, what does your day look like? How are you setting yourself up to try to take as much of this in as possible?
Well, I like to start with College Game Day, of course, and I was excited to see Lee Corso's 250th headgear pick. It was so hilariously predictable when, of course, he put the headgear on backwards. That was like the crowning moment. But my day typically involves a lot of TiVo. When you've got this many big matchups, especially this season for some reason, it seems that every game has these serious implications as we've seen sort of this topsy-turvy thing going back and forth. Especially in the month of November, it involves a lot of TiVo because every game ends up being a little bit important.
Yeah, important for the college football playoff, of course, and the conference championships, but also important for the most prestigious award in sports, I believe, which is the Heisman Trophy. I'm not always on board with the preseason candidacy that kind of carries through that you really need to either be one of those preseason candidates or just set the world on fire to be considered. I don't completely agree with the process, but in terms of this being the most prestigious award in sports, I will make that argument. Nobody remembers who wins the NFL MVP, but the Heisman Trophy, wow. So that's also on the line. So give us your progress report right now. We're at the first week of November. How you believe the Heisman race stands right now?
Yeah, we're first week of November, so this is really when we're going to see leaders emerge from that Heisman candidacy crowd. And it's interesting to see whether or not the college football playoff selections will end up playing into Heisman candidacy selections or even into the Heisman finalist, the winner. I, of course, am assuming when I look at Heisman candidacy this year that individual performance will be tied to team performance as it usually is. I think that we're going to end up seeing a winner emerge from one of the four teams that's probably selected for the playoff. So when looking at how the timetable for that plays out, it's interesting too because the final four teams will be announced on December 7th. Heisman votes are due on December 8th. So there's that narrow window there where you could see Heisman voters be swayed by the playoff committee's selections. And we may not be surprised by the final four teams that they select. Maybe it'll be the first year ever that there's no argument and it's very clear-cut. But it'll be interesting to see if there's any hangover or spillover, perhaps is the better word, from the playoff committee's selections that weekend as final votes are turned in. In regards to the SEC, of course, you're kind of looking towards the SEC West if you're looking at possible Heisman candidates, and you've got to start with the undefeated darling of the SEC West, Mississippi State. Everyone loves the Dak attack. Dak Prescott had a phenomenal year with seamless performances, 2,025 yards for the season, 61.1% completion percentage. He's actually 8th in the SEC right now for rushing, 725 yards. If we continue to see Mississippi State winning out as they have been, I think that he's going to be at the forefront of that Heisman candidacy discussion. I think he'd probably be a hard player to beat because he's played really, really well, even in close games. I mean, he's managed to keep his wits about him, and Heisman voters love the emergence of a new star, the Cinderella, if you will. So Dak may kind of be able to take advantage of that situation. But breathing down the neck of Mississippi State, of course, you've got a couple of other teams, first being Alabama. And Amari Cooper has been a trendy name for the Heisman all year long, putting in fantastic performances as well. 1,132 yards receiving right now. He's second in the country for reception yards, so he's definitely somebody you want to keep an eye on if he remains dominant through the rest of the season. He's buoyed, of course, by the performance of his quarterback Blake Sims, who's gotten consistently better as the season went on, which is surprising. Since the beginning of the season, we weren't even sure if he was going to be starting, but he's consistently gotten better. He's at 2,034 yards right now with a 65.5% completion percentage, playing just a little bit better than Dak Prescott himself. So if Alabama's able to upset Mississippi State in 2 weeks, if they're able to defeat Auburn at the end of November, we may be looking at Alabama leading that Heisman conversation with presumably Amari Cooper at the front of it, perhaps even Blake Sims. And you can't forget there is a third team, as overwhelming as that can be when you're talking about the West Division, in Auburn, who's also a one-loss team. Nick Marshall, not putting up the numbers that the other quarterbacks are, at least as far as passing, of course. I think he's at 1,357 yards, 59.6% completion percentage. So not quite where the other quarterbacks are, but it was interesting. You saw last Saturday, Gus Malzahn started to use him a little bit more in like the running quarterback situations that you saw him using last year. So if Auburn returns to be as dominant on offense at the end of this season as they became at the end of last season, and is able to, upset Alabama, finds themselves in the SEC championship game and with a playoff berth, you could be looking at Nick Marshall, who last year did lead his team to the championship game. You could certainly merit a conversation there. Or perhaps behind him, Cameron Artis-Payne. He's leading the SEC in rushing yards right now with 974 yards, but probably most likely, if Auburn finds themselves in that situation, we'll all be talking about Nick Marshall. So I think those are kind of the 5 to watch right now in the SEC West, and I think a lot of who we'll be talking about will come down to not only individual performance, but just as much team performance and who's left standing at the end, pumping up their stats right there at the end as we go into Heisman contention week.
Yeah, unfortunately, Todd Gurley not with us for the past 5, 6, 7 weeks. That's completely changed the Heisman Trophy race and possibly changed Georgia's season, not having him against Florida this past Saturday and knocking them down a notch or two in the SEC East at this point. So while you were speaking, and I was hanging on to every word, Brittnee, I jotted down 7 names here. So I'm right with you with Dak Prescott. I don't see how he's not the front runner at this point. Undefeated football team, a number of huge plays, the stats, it all adds up for Dak Prescott being the leading candidate right now. I think right after him, if we're going out to a national scope, Marcus Mariota at Oregon would be the next guy. He's got all the stats, the glitz, he's got the name, he's got his football team probably jumping into the top 4 this week with Ole Miss losing to Auburn. I would expect the Ducks to jump into the Final 4. Jameis Winston, despite the issues off the field, as you pointed out to us a few weeks ago, this kid's having a better season this year than he did in winning the Heisman Trophy last season. So Jameis Winston still needs to be considered. His team undefeated, and he played well in the clutch in the win against Notre Dame. I've got Amir Abdullah for Nebraska. The 2 Big Ten backs pretty much have to overwhelm everybody with statistics because their teams have lost games, especially with Melvin Gordon. I've got him in the mix with Wisconsin. They just have to rush for a zillion yards. But Abdullah's got a team that's got 1 loss, so they've got a fringe of an outside look at the college football playoff at this point. Amari Cooper, I've got him at 5, and you ran down his resume to date. And Everett Golson, the quarterback for Notre Dame, I've got him at 6. And again, I just jotted these down off the top of my head. Of course, Notre Dame still on the fringe of the college football playoff at this point. So if they're able to win out, the one thing that bothers me about the Heisman situation is that we find out after the vote that there's a number of people that vote before every game is played. I don't understand that at all, how you can possibly cast a vote before the season's over. So 1 and 2 weeks before the season's over, people are casting votes without all the games being played. So I think that should be an automatic, we take your vote away, you have not used it properly, maybe you'll get a chance to get it back in a few years. So that's one problem I have with Heisman. But
I completely agree. I mean,
your Heisman is pretty accurate. Sorry, I think we missed that.
Oh, sorry, you froze up there for a moment, but I completely agree. I think the last 2 weeks of college football season are 2 of the most important. You've got rivalry week, which for some teams, Auburn, Alabama, the Iron Bowl, you've got the Egg Bowl, and then you've got your conference championships. I don't think you should be able to cast a vote for the best player in college football before rivalry week or the conference championships have been played.
I'm right there with you. and they should do something about that. But yeah, it should be interesting. And Dak Prescott, I believe, has his hands on the Heisman right now. But with Alabama and Ole Miss in the way, there's certainly opportunity for others to jump in there. All right, a couple of weeks ago, Brittnee, we were talking about one Will Muschamp and his situation in Florida on the hot seat, of course. And now things really hadn't changed for him, maybe had even gotten a little bit worse until, bam, his team came out and exploded on Georgia in, to date, the biggest game of the season for the Florida Gators. So they're suddenly, as we talked about just a few minutes ago with Joe, they're in the running for the SEC Eastern Division. They're still back with 3 losses, Missouri with 1, so they need help, but that help is pretty reasonable and logical in thinking that they could get help looking at those schedules for the other 2 teams, Georgia and Mizzou. So how does this stand right now? You're down there in Florida, and you're hearing all sorts of things that we don't hear elsewhere. You hear the stuff going on the streets with Florida Gator fans and just SEC football fans that like to talk and speculate. So where does Will Muschamp stand now that everybody's very disappointed with the guy, but bam, he comes up with his signature win this past Saturday?
Well, it's funny. I was curious about the same thing. So I spent most of the weekend kind of polling Gator fans in person on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, trying to get a feel, kind of gauge the temperature and see where things are at now with Gator football fans. And I think it could probably best be described as quiet happiness and cautious optimism. Gator fans are, of course, elated that they defeated probably their biggest rival, certainly their biggest conference rival in Georgia, but there's still that element of uncertainty of, you know, what's going to happen next week. Are we going to have another bad game now that we perhaps have a little bit of overconfidence as a result of this victory against the Bulldogs? Will we find ourselves seeing 2 Gator players trying to tackle each other during a game again? Gator fans really aren't sure where this heads from here. Will they win out the rest of their games, manage to defeat South Carolina, make it a close one against Florida State, or even upset their state rival, Florida State? I see Gator fans being very, very happy, but being very cautiously optimistic about how to move forward, and perhaps being a bit more subtle in their celebrations than they would normally be after such a big win. So it's interesting. I don't know that Muschamp is out of hot water yet, but it's certainly at least almost to lukewarm at this point. And that victory, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, and you'd asked, you know, would a victory over Georgia and a victory over Florida State be enough to save his job? And I said no. I didn't think that it would be, but they're quite a bit quieter this week. I don't think many of them predicted that upset. So Gator Nation, I would say, is cautiously optimistic.
Well, it's funny, Brittnee, because the record could be very underwhelming. They've got 3 losses right now. They've got the date against Florida State, which, of course, does not factor into the SEC race. So let's say they lose to Florida State, but they still go through that set of scenarios we played out a few minutes ago, and they make their way to the SEC championship game with 4 losses. So they're an 8-4 football team. And there you go. They probably lose that game. They're going to be a significant underdog, and they're 8-5, but they made it to the SEC championship game. So I don't know what the hierarchy at Florida is thinking, if they're just going to go strictly by the feel of where this program is headed, regardless of record, or there are magic wins. Georgia would be one, Florida State would be one. If they could somehow knock off an Alabama or Mississippi State or Auburn in the SEC championship game, that would be significant, and that might be a scenario where Florida fans don't know what to root for because they want the guy out the door, but they want to win an SEC championship, and that's probably going to keep his job. So am I surprised by them defeating Georgia in that fashion? Kind of, but not really, because I think what we have here is just inconsistency. So I wouldn't be surprised if they went to Nashville this next Saturday and somehow fumbled around a loss to Vandy like 17-13 or something like that. It's a talented roster that has not put it together. The offense has been out of sync this entire season. Even the performance against Georgia was just running the football and somehow dominating the line of scrimmage. They couldn't throw it. They didn't even try to throw it. They threw the ball 6 times it was certainly a throwback to yesteryear and some outdated game planning from a balance perspective, but hey, it worked. And so, yeah, Will Muschamp. I don't have a guess on how this is going to play out, but I think he needs to do a little bit more to keep his job.
Yeah, I've got to ask you, do you think that Georgia wins that game if they've got Todd Gurley?
I'm sorry, Brittnee, one more time. We're having some issues here.
I'm interested to know, do you think that Georgia manages to win that game if they've got Todd Gurley? Would that have been enough of a difference maker?
Because of the way it played out, the dominance of Florida and where the dominance was placed, it was not necessarily in stopping Nick Chubb, who ran for like 156 yards. It was a dominant Florida running game, and unless they were going to throw Todd Gurley in to play like outside linebacker and tackle some people, I don't really think he would have made that much of a difference. There would have been an added option, one of the best you could imagine on that side of the ball, but really the problems were with stopping the run, and yeah, Mr. Gurley doesn't play that side of the football, so I really don't think he would have had that much of an impact in that game as Florida rolled in that one. So, all right, now we've got, we have to bring it up, Brittnee. I'm sorry, we just have to, because you know you go on record when you come on here on the SEC in 60. So just a few weeks ago, I'm not going to say you were bold with this prediction, but you did throw it out there. It's Mississippi State, it's Georgia in the SEC championship game. So well, a status report on the prediction would be, of course, Georgia's in trouble. Mississippi State still has two very important football games. So how are you feeling about your pick at this point?
Obviously not very good. And when I made it, I think I just made it with like as an assumption. Like the SEC West is up for debate. They'll be playing Georgia. But no, who would have thought that at this point Missouri would be the front runner? The same Missouri that has been shut out, that lost to Indiana. But I stand corrected. We'll have to see how this one plays out. I heard you two run through the scenarios earlier of how this could kind of all shake out. We could end up seeing a three-way tie. My prediction's obviously out the window. I don't know what to think of the SEC East at this point. We'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, and at least you made a prediction. I'm still not. I've been too scared to make a prediction the entire season. People have asked me all season, what was your prediction? Didn't make a prediction. I just have people on making other predictions. They make their own predictions, and I just kind of host and then criticize later and make fun later. That's the easy way to play it. I guess if I'm going to throw one out there right now, I still think Georgia's the best team in the East, but they've got a game against Auburn. And I just don't think they survive that game. And then if that becomes their third loss in the SEC, that leaves it wide open for Florida and Missouri. Missouri's only got one loss. So, and the three games that Mizzou has aren't that difficult. There's no Bama, Auburn in there. It's Texas A&M. It's Tennessee. It's Arkansas. Mizzou should win this thing. They should win it. They're 4-1. They're set up for it and one in the conference and win this thing. So mathematically, the probabilities in Mizzou's camp. So we're going to go Mizzou, and we're going to go with Alabama, I believe, is playing Auburn at home. Got to go with the Tide. So we've got the matchup we've all been waiting for, Alabama and Missouri in the SEC championship game. Now I'm on record.
Yeah, now you're on record, and I will be back to roast you if your predictions do not come true as mine didn't. So, holding you to it.
Of course, I had the advantage of like 8 or 9 games played before I made my prediction. Actually, I did make a prediction preseason. It was Alabama, South Carolina in the SEC championship game. It just came to me. I did make that prediction. It's on record. And of course, South Carolina, we've been talking about them for, most of this show, because they're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting to see Steve Spurrier's reaction over the weekend. I don't know if you caught his press conference. It was all of 58 seconds long, just classic Spurrier, short, cutting, out. It was he's always entertaining. He and Les Miles, I think, are the two most entertaining college football coaches they are, but we'll have to see. He's a fantastic coach. Perhaps he can rally his guys. They've still got a couple more weeks of football, good games on the schedule as we've been discussing. It would be interesting to see how the rest of those games play out for South Carolina.
Yeah, the SEC just doesn't win the most important games on the field. They win the post-game news conference awards as well. Spurrier, yes, pure gold. And Spurrier is either going to talk for 45 minutes or he's going to pull one of those where I don't want to talk. I'm going to make a statement and I'm out of here. Les Miles will always talk, win or lose. Brett Bielema, you can throw him into that mix too. He's been quite entertaining, more so from the standpoint of saying very odd things and saying, well, those two say very odd things as well, saying very less comical but kind of rubbing some people the wrong way. And for Mr. Brett Bielema, the wins are going to have to follow at some point, or he's going to have to not be so outspoken. 16 consecutive losses in the conference, but it's, again, like we've talked about, a much different scenario in the SEC. If that Arkansas program could pick itself up and go play in the Big 12 suddenly and switch spots with Missouri or somebody, then, I think it would be much different outcomes for them.
Yeah, absolutely. God bless him. I do like Brett, but he's in a tough spot and in a tough conference, and there's not much room for growing slowly in the SEC. You've got to come with your big boy pants on at the beginning of the season to be ready to go.
All right, Brittnee, we appreciate the time. Thanks for classing up the show a little bit. It's a tough task. You can't class it up all the way, but you do your best, so we appreciate that.
Always happy to help. Thanks for having me on.
All right, Brittnee, take care. Have a great week. We will talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
All right, everyone. Again, this is Lisi. We bring in some of the top bloggers across the country. Brittnee Taylor Newman, she writes for Football.com and The Last Word on Sports as well. Again, SEC and SIC Live right here on Google Hangouts every Monday at noon. We also post this video to YouTube at MarkRogersTV, and it's podcast versions on Podbean and also iTunes. I think you've heard of iTunes. Catch the SEC in 60 there. Again, we bring on the bloggers from across the country that cover SEC football. And if you love college football, period, hey, check out my YouTube channel at MarkRogersTV, because we talk college football across the nation. This is just a snippet of that on the SEC in 60. And we thank the Dr. SEC, for bringing us on board on the SEC Fans Radio Network to talk the SEC each and every Monday. And you can hear it throughout the week. I believe at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, 1 o'clock Central, right here on the SEC Radio Network. That would be the SECRadioNetwork.com. So if you're checking us out on YouTube or on Google and you just want to hear the broadcast and be able to do the chores around the house or workout or whatever, catch us on our podcast. Again, Mark Rogers TV at Podbean or iTunes, the SEC in 60s right there, or on the SEC Radio Network, SECRadioNetwork.com. Check out the SEC in 60. All right, folks. We love the talk about the SEC, and this college football playoff committee situation is going to get more and more fun as the games are played and the decision becomes even more difficult and more crucial to the outcome of those 4 teams. All right, would love to hear from you on Twitter at MarkRogersTV. Check me out there, and we will talk up some college football. We do it 24/7, 365. Until we talk to you next time, may God bless you and enjoy the football.